In today's video, I'm going to show you how I use Photoshop to easily transform a dull, lifeless image just like this into a beautiful piece of art just like this. So this is the raw file that we're going to be working on, and now this sort of image is going to work particularly well for this editing style because we've got one small subject that's kind of lost in this great scene. We've got the sea, we've got the sky, and then just the tiny little element in the middle, and that is why it's going to work so well. But there are a few things I need to do in Lightroom just to get this image into a workable state. First of all, up that exposure quite a bit because it is so dark. Bring down the highlights just so that we're not losing out any detail in these clouds. I'm also going to bring up the shadows in the bottom of the frame. Also going to up the white balance because it looks quite cold, but I don't really need to pay attention to the colors right now because there's a lot more that I'm going to be doing later. Because I have done these types of edits on this channel before, and while I'm going to be going over some of those same techniques today, I'm also going to be showing you some tips on how to take it even further. Now, there is a little bit of natural lens vignetting, and I could try and move this down just to try and, move this up to try and counter that, but to be honest, I actually think I might enjoy having a little bit of vignetting going on in the final image, so I'm not too concerned about that right now. Lastly, I'm going to bring in a crop just to straighten up our horizon and also just bring the scene down a little bit, something a little bit more like that. But I don't want to crop right in on the boat because the point of the image is very much to have that negative space, and we still do with this crop, but it's centralized that boat. And I think it's going to look much better. So we right click, edit in Photoshop. So here we are, and first of all I'm going to duplicate that background layer just so that we've got it. I'm going to zoom in on the boat. Now I took this on a 100 megapixel medium format camera, so there is a lot of detail, and that is going to help me make a better selection of the boat. When I've done these sorts of shots with a low resolution camera, can be a little bit more tricky, but we should be good. And actually, as I zoom in, I've realized that I haven't actually got it exactly pin sharp here. I think my shutter speed may have been a little bit too low. There's a bit of blurriness on the boat, but again, that's really not going to be much of a problem. So first things first, I'm going to select the object selection tool because, to be honest, I expect Photoshop to do a pretty good job of this. If I just click on the boat, the object selection tool has done a good job of selecting most of the boat, but there are a couple of bits like this flag here that haven't been selected. So I'm just going to use the magic wand tool. I've set my tolerance to about 18, and hopefully that should just mean I can vaguely click on these bits. Same on this buoy and of course the mast here, and it will just fill in those extra bits for us. The rigging, the lines, I'm going to put in later, so I'm not going to worry too much about that right now. So I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to copy and paste that onto a new layer. Then going to turn that off, go back to this layer, and just so I've got a bit of a reference point, I'm just going to draw a square around it, copy, paste that, and I'm just going to call this one reference. This one we'll just call boat. If you're going to be working with a few layers, it can be important to name them just so you know what's on which one. It's just a bit of a time saver, keeps things neat. But now we're going to get to the important part of doing the blur, but in order to do a neat blur, we first need to delete the boat from the scene. Otherwise, what we'll get is a big blurry patch in the middle where the boat is. So, should be fairly easy in Photoshop these days. It used to be a bit more of a pain to do that kind of thing. Now, I think we can just put in an elliptical circle over the top, probably just go with generative fill, and see what it does. Now it looks to me like that boat is still there, but that is because we've still got our reference turned on and our boat turned on. Haha, without them, we have got basically an empty space. It doesn't look like the neatest job, but that's not a problem because we're about to completely change this layer anyway. So I'm going to merge that down because we don't need to mess about with it. And then in our background copy, we are going to go to, in fact, let's rename this to blur layer. We're going to go to filter and blur gallery, and then we're going to go with path blur. Now this is going to basically bring up an arrow in whatever direction we point this arrow in is a direction that we're going to see the blur. Now, for me, I always want to make sure that my line of blur follows the natural lines in the scene. In this case, we have got this nice horizon, and it's a completely straight horizon, so I don't need to do any kind of manipulation to this line. If you've got a horizon that's got a bit more of a curve to it, you can grab it and you can create a curve. You can create multiple curve points, so you can actually have that blend, that blur following the curve. We don't need to, so we can just go with, what have I done? We can just create a nice line blur like this, all the way along our horizon, and then we take our speed from 50%, and hey, let's whack it up to 500. So now we have a lovely blurred layer, and we've got lovely smooth lines going across on this water. The clouds are all smoothed out. It looks great. It looks very much like one of those intentional camera movements where you use a slow shutter speed and sweep your camera across the scene, except this one we have faked. There's our before, and there's our after. So far, it's going well. So now if we turn back on our boat layer, then you can see that we're actually most of the way there to our finished image. We've got the blur, we've got the boat sitting really nicely in the scene. But of course, it's still very grey, it's very flat, it's very lifeless. So now is the time when we really start to refine our image and take it to the next level. And I'm going to start that by doing some color adjustments to our background layer. Because basically what we've got here is a very grey looking scene. There's not a lot of contrast, there's not a lot of life and vibrancy. So that is what I'm going to try and bring back in. And because this is already a created, quite abstract image, we can afford to push our colours quite far. So let's go to our adjustments, and I'm just going to bring in a photo filter first of all. And I think I want to try and cool this down. And you can apply all different kind of cooling tones that bring in oranges, cooling tones that bring in the blues, warming filters that bring in the oranges. We could apply a green, but I think something that is a bit more bluey and cooler is kind of what I want to go for here. Maybe not quite a magenta. What about this underwater? That is just adding a nice coolness to our scene overall. So I'm just going to clip that so that it's only applying to our background layer. It's not applying to our boat. So if I turn that off and on, bit difficult to see, but we can see that the boat is not changing in color at all. So I'm actually going to merge that down again, just so that we've got that there. And I'm just going to duplicate this layer. And then I'm going to go into our camera raw filter. Now this is then just going to bring up the exact same controls that we would have in Lightroom. So it's very easy to work with if you are experienced with Lightroom already. Now a couple of things I want to do is just up that exposure a little bit more because it still looks a little bit dark. Bring those highlights down a little bit. And I'm going to up the contrast and maybe even see what it looks like to add a bit of clarity into this scene, because it is going to help bring out some of these amazing lines going across the water there. And it also brings out some of the detail in the clouds. So I'm actually going to put our clarity to about plus 25, which is quite a lot. I mean, you can play around with these sliders all you want. There is no right or wrong way to do this. And actually adding a little bit of dehaze really does help bring out even more of that detail. So I'm going to go plus 8, plus 10. Let's just go plus 10. Round number with our dehaze. So in our color then, we can play with our temperature. Let's cool it down to make it even more blue. But then what about adding in some nice magenta tone in there as well? Of course, we can up our vibrance to really make those colors stand out even more. And I could even go in and try and mess around with some of our hues of our colors, maybe bring those blues down a little bit. About these aquas, I don't really think there's much of anything else in there. I think it's pretty much going to be all blues and purples, to be honest. Then we can go into our color grading tab. Now this allows you to add different colors to the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. So you can create some quite interesting effects, particularly on this kind of image. I'm not entirely sure what color is going to work best. So what I quite like to do is just add in some saturation. Maybe quite a lot, just so you can kind of get an idea of how it looks, and then grab that hue slider and just start moving it around the color wheel. And so you can kind of see what different looks you're going to get. So it may be that I want to add in a little bit of magenta into those blues. Maybe not actually. Maybe a little bit more sort of like a tealy blue, something like this looks quite nice. And then we could look about adding in some warmth, maybe into our highlights, something like that. A lot of pros using color grading will make sure to use proper color science to put the right complementary colors in the right place. But to be honest, with this sort of image, because it is a bit more abstract, I just basically like playing around and seeing what we get. Not really paying attention to any kind of should or should not do's. I'm just basically adjusting, playing with the sliders, and seeing what I like. So if I just have a look at our before and our after, that is what we have done to this layer. So as you can see, we have made quite a big difference. But I think I can do a little bit more, and I'm going to use some gradients at this point. I'm going to first of all bring one in for our bottom half, our ocean layer. I'm going to up those whites a little bit, maybe up those highlights, and maybe a little bit more exposure, because we've darkened it down and we're starting to lose some of the detail on those nice lines in the water. So I wonder what adding in a little bit more clarity would do here. It actually darkens it further, but it does bring them out a bit. So I'm going to add in a little bit of clarity, but then a bit more in the exposure. And then I'm going to do another mask, and this one coming down just for the sky. I'm going to bring down those highlights because kind of at risk of getting a bit of a hot spot here. Okay, I mean, that's looking pretty good to me so far. But I'll be honest, one of the things that I do with these sorts of shots is layer my image up, and I'll go back into Camera Raw again and again and again, and maybe again one more time. And I might end up layering different colors on top of each other to create something even more vibrant and maybe even a little bit psychedelic. Because again, there is no right or wrong way to do this, so the best thing to do is to sit in Photoshop, maybe get a cup of tea and just play around and see what you can do. Let's press OK, and here we are with our scene as it stands so far. We've made some good adjustments to that sky, and there is our boat. Probably noticed, our boat is a little bit dark because we haven't made any adjustments to the boat layer. So we need to do that, and I reckon we can do that pretty much just using our maybe our levels on the boat. I will clip it just so that it is only applying to the boat, and we can just bring that up here, maybe bring down that for an extra little bit of contrast. Suddenly our boat is standing out really nicely. If we turn that off and on, whoo, yeah, look at the difference. That looks really nice already. And that's just with one tool. That's all we needed to do. Perfect. But there is one thing I have noticed now I've just upped that. And now we've got this weird fringe going on around the boat that I'm really not too keen on. So I'm hoping that there's an easy way to fix that. So I'm going to press Command Shift, and then I'm going to just click on the boat layer. Now that is just going to select our object. And now we go into Select and Modify. And I'm just going to contract that selection by 2 pixels. I'm then going to inverse that selection. I'm just going to delete. Okay, 2 pixels was far too many. So let's undo that, undo, modify, contract. 1 pixel. And let's try that again. Select inverse and then delete. And it's done a much better job. It is not absolutely perfect, but to be honest, we are zoomed in so far here that if we just have a look at it on the outside and full screen, it looks great. Sure, if I had a bit more time, I could really refine that even further. And if you're doing this for yourself, then, you know, do spend an extra 10 to 15 minutes to get that just right. But for me, that looks pretty much spot on. But one thing I do want to try and do now is kind of focus on how it's blending with the water a little bit more, because there is just this very hard line here of where the boat goes to the water. So I'm just going to bring in a mask like this, and I'm going to get my gradient tool. It's set to black and white. Painting with black, of course, hides your layer, and white reveals it. So in this case, if I've got a black and white gradient, I can just drag that up, and as you can see, it will just naturally create a feather for our boat. I don't want to go too far. I'm just trying to refine this nicely to kind of give the impression that it's sort of sitting within the waves and that maybe they are all kind of ghostly around it. And I do think that that is enough. Looks really nice. It's sort of, yeah, definitely a nice fade out, but it's not too much. It's not overpowering the rest of the boat. But the other thing it's missing is that rigging, and I want to put that back in because that is a nice part of the boat, and I do think that even at full screen you will still be able to tell that that rigging isn't there. And that is why I've brought in my reference, because that is perfectly over the top of the boat. So what I'm hoping to be able to do is basically just draw in those lines on top of where our rigging already is. I'm going to do that just by using the line tool. I'm going to have it set to black, 1 pixel, and hopefully with this I can just bring in a line like this. I'm going to bring in another line like this, and then one like this. I'm just going to keep on going. I'm just going to group all of these together, put them into a folder, and call that folder rigging. So I can now turn off our reference just like this, and we have got our rigging in place. But of course, it does look a little bit ridiculous. It looks a little bit fake, and that is because it is so bold. So what I can just do is grab that opacity and I can bring it down. And as I do, you can see it really starts to disappear into the scene, and as a result, it does blend much more naturally. So I think I'm just going to leave it at 20%. And that pretty much looks, I think, like it actually did in the picture. I think when you turn that on and off, that rigging looks like the same rigging we had before. So I'm pretty pleased with how that looks. So at this point, I can pretty much get rid of that reference, but I'm just going to turn it off for now. So I'm really happy with the rigging. I'm really happy with the blend. But there is one more thing that I want to do to help the boat look even better, and that is just to add a reflection. Now, that should be fairly easy to do. I'm going to start off by selecting the boat. Again, like before, pressing Command-Shift and just clicking on that thumbnail. And I'm going to just copy and paste it onto a new layer. And then I'm going to just rename that layer Reflection. And then I'm going to just do Command-T, right-click on this, and flip vertical. And now it is given a nice mirror image that we need to then negotiate into place. I'm going to just slightly tweak it a little bit because I need it to line up with each bit of the boat. Of course, it does look a little bit weird like right now, so we need to do a few more things to make this look a bit more realistic. First of all, I really want to sort out the perspective because it wouldn't just naturally be a perfect reflection like this. So I want to do a bit of an adjustment here by pulling out this perspective point and then free transform, and I'm just going to drag it downwards like this. Now, this isn't going to be the most accurate reflection. That's not necessarily what I'm going for because, of course, there wouldn't be an accurate reflection with this much blur going on. So it's very much a sort of my interpretation of what I think it should look like. So I'm going to accept that change. I'm just going to use my keys, my arrow keys, just to nudge it down a few pixels. And then I'm going to get my levels adjustment on it. Again, we clip it, this down a little bit just to darken it. And then on the reflection layer, bring our opacity right down, like really right down. It's going to be plus 20. That's where we're going to go to. So that should already start looking better. And then we're going to do a Gaussian blur just to blur it out. Maybe a little bit more than that. Yeah, something like that looks pretty good to me. And then finally, I'm going to add a mask. We're going to get our gradient back out, and I'm just going to draw this in like this, just so that it kind of naturally blends out away from our boat. Something like this. Something like that, I think, looks spot on. So now, if I zoom out, we've got our boat, and we've got our reflection as well. And of course, you can go back in and play around with this if you want to. There's no necessarily right or wrong way to do this. If we had a look at the reference, I'm going to turn off. Let's just have a look at the picture. There is no reflection. And that's fine. There doesn't need to be. But I think it kind of works nicely for this picture, just to have that little bit of reflection. I actually think I might turn it down even more. Let's bring it down to 12%. 8%. It's just a hint. A tiny hint of reflection. That's all we need. I'm not super happy with all of this color, to be honest. It's not looking great. It's just all blue. So I'm going to try and play around with the color a little bit more. I might see about adding another photo filter. This time maybe we add the magenta one at this point. That looks kind of nice, but maybe bring the density down something like this. That's already looking quite interesting, I think. Yes, I like this a lot more already. Great. So let's merge that with our blur layer copy. I'm going to duplicate that again. And this time I'm going to go back into Camera Raw filter. We're just going to start layering up our colors. Bring our saturation down, but our vibrancy up. Maybe, yeah, something like that's looking okay. Maybe we go back into color grading. What about here? What about adding in some real deep blues into our shadows this time? Something like this, which is kind of giving me a nice sunset look. We've got the last of that warm light in the sky, but it's bathing the scene in front of us with magenta. Just turn that off and on. Yeah, I actually really like what that's doing. And if we have a look before and after in Camera Raw this time, I think we've added some nice color there. You can really afford to push things quite far when we're doing this. One thing I do think I need to do though is just add a little bit of warmth to the boat itself, because the boat is basically now pure white because it's been white balanced basically, but now we've got all these other tones which realistically would be sort of reflecting on that boat and making the boat a little bit more orange colored with the sunset, the sunset. So I'm actually just going to add on a photo filter just onto the boat, off and on. No, on, there we go. So you can kind of see, if we zoom right in, with it off, that boat is a very cool white tone. Oops. With it on, it's got much more of like a nice warmth to it, which is exactly what we need. And we could always change that to more of a magenta. Oh, it's very pink though, isn't it, that magenta? So maybe we add a bit of orange to the boat, and then maybe we go back in with another one. So let's turn those both off and then on again. I think we've color balanced that boat really nicely. I think it now matches the rest of the scene in a great way. I just think that magenta is a little bit too strong. So I'm just going to tone that down using the opacity. It's barely there, but it's just enough to help it blend, I think, a little bit more naturally. So we can merge that down, and now we've got our boat looking pretty good on our water. So at this point, I think I'm sort of in the end game, really. We've done so much to transform this image, but I think there may still be some more to do. So I'm just going to basically create a new merged layer of everything we've done so far, because I want to now do some overall toning and adjustments that's going to affect all of it. And I want it to affect the boat as well, not just the background. So I'm going to go back into Camera Raw filter in this new layer. And first thing I want to do is bring in a radial gradient down here that's basically just going to be affecting our water. I'm going to up the whites, maybe a bit of extra contrast, a bit more clarity. Yeah, just a little touch. And then I'm going to create another one. And this one I'm going to have coming down like this. From this, we've got this nice kind of highlight patch in the sky. And it almost kind of looks like the sun is kind of trying to break through those clouds and flood the scene with warmth. So what I'm going to do is just ever so slightly up the exposure. And I'm then going to just add in a hint of warmth. Plus 10, maybe a little bit of magenta tint just to help it blend. So just turn that off and on, off and on. Yeah, I really like how that looks. It's adding that nice warmth into the middle of the scene. But because we've got this as a radial gradient, it's also casting that light down onto the water, which, if anything, is kind of making our boats, the reflection, actually look more like a shadow coming from this light which is emanating from behind it. Now, the only thing that I might just do is, because obviously the radial gradient is going all the way below onto the water, but it's also going up onto the rest of the sky. So I think if I just subtract from that using a linear gradient, I can just bring this in from the top like that. And you can even just see on this little icon here, or if I hover over it, you can see now that that mask is no longer applying to the top of the sky. So if we turn it off and on, it is now essentially like a beam of light casting down from the middle of the scene, which I think looks pretty cool for this image. Like, no, it doesn't look natural, but None of this image looks natural. We're not going for natural. We're going for an interesting fine art style Photoshop manipulation. So it kind of feels fair game. What about this extra bit of dehaze? Yeah, it's bringing in... This is the thing I was saying, that it's almost like bringing in that vignette back that we had from the lens. And if anything, it's really kind of helping focus the attention on the boat in the middle of the scene, which, yeah, I think looks really cool. Of course, you may well hate it, but, you know, that's the point. You can do this exactly as you want to. And up the highlights on this filter just to help bring the boat out of the scene a little bit more. So let's have a look. Before and after. That looks good. Let's press OK and commit those changes. We can always copy it again. And we can go back in. We can do this as many times as we want, layering things up over the top. If we wanted to add in an extra little bit of warmth, maybe bring in some extra magenta, maybe then bring in that dehaze that we took out. We press OK and we think, oh, you know, it is nice, but is it a bit too much? So you grab your opacity slider, maybe bring it down a little bit, and then merge that layer down and then duplicate that layer, and we can go again and just add in these little things again and again. And it's by doing them again and again that you're going to create something that is radically different from the image you started out with. And of course, if you want to duplicate it again, you can go back into Camera Raw and play with any presets that you might have got that might add a completely different look to this image. I think I've just got the default ones built in here. Let's have a look at some of these. I mean, I don't like any of these, to be honest, but you get the idea. You can certainly really change things up if you want. But then even something like, let's say this warm and moody, if we said OK to that one, it's completely changed our image, but then we could bring it right back to 0 and maybe just bring in, let's say, 25% of the effect. If we turn it off and on, what it has done is just add a nice hint of warmth. Again, just sort of leaning into that slight sunset vibe that we've got going on. I'm actually just going to bring that back to 10% because I don't hate it, but I just don't need all that much of it. Now, I really like what we've done here. We have completely transformed this image from what we started with, bearing in mind that this was our original image. This boring, lifeless, flat shot of this boat, a boat so dark you can barely even see it on the water. And here is what we've done. We've created this colourful, vibrant, striking image, full of detail, full of life. But just to see how this looks in a sort of fine art setting, let's put a white border on it. Let's just go extend our canvas relatively by 1,000 pixels because this is a very high resolution shot. Canvas extension white. Okay. And there we go. Framed beautifully. Our serene scene of a boat on the water. Well, I think I should probably wrap up at this point, but if you haven't tried this kind of edit before, then definitely do. And I really hope that if you've tried doing this edit from some of my earlier videos, that maybe you've got a little bit more out of this one. But my main points still stand in that there is no right or wrong way to do this kind of edit. So it's entirely up to you to just dive into Photoshop, play with those sliders, layer up your colors, and see what results you can get. Because I already did a test edit of this photo before recording this video, and that one looks completely different to the one that I've just done. And I know full well that if I did another one, that one would look different again. So it's always just really fun playing around and experimenting. And the great thing with doing these kinds of edits is that you don't need to head out specifically to go and take photos for it. It may well be that you've got loads of photos of people on beaches or coastal images like the ones that we've been working on today already in your library. So you can have a look through, see if you can find the types of images that you think will work well, and see what you can achieve. But I really hope you've enjoyed this video. I really hope that you found it useful. If you have, then please do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, click that like button and maybe even give me a subscribe if you don't already. And I will see you next time.